Today we are going to be discussing counseling and the rehabilitation process. The counselor-client relationship is obviously essential. The outcome may vary depending upon the nature of this relationship. The outcome may also vary depending upon the type of expectations that we have as counselors for the consumer. So if we're looking at doing personal adjustment counseling, we might use one type of counseling approach. If we're looking at doing something like helping somebody role play a job interview, we might use a different approach. If we're helping somebody to process through a situation that they have with another person, we might use a third approach. So certainly the outcome may vary depending upon what it is the expectations are. Another obvious statement is that rehabilitation counselors must have a genuine interest in their consumers and not play favorites or reject consumers because of differences in beliefs or backgrounds. And as we've been talking about, it's important to demonstrate empathy, respect, positive regard, genuineness, concreteness, and understanding of backgrounds that people have in terms of cultural sensitivities. Maintaining boundaries is a given. That is boundaries between you and the consumer, that certainly we have to have a professional relationship with the consumer. And we have to maintain our ethical boundaries and ethical responsibilities. And in another lecture we will be discussing ethics and some examples of ethical dilemmas that might arise. Some of the more typical ones, though, would be things like, what do you do if you see the consumer outside of the rehabilitation sphere, the system? If you see somebody in a store or a restaurant, how do you approach somebody or not approach somebody, recognize somebody? And these are sometimes tricky issues to address and don't have easy answers either. And sometimes in that case that I gave might depend upon how the consumer responds to you. The first area I want to talk about is a theoretical framework. There is a vast knowledge of theories out there that enable the counselor to be open to different techniques and to use an approach that is unique to each consumer. And so that means, in the way my thinking is that we would apply different approaches to different consumers depending upon what the issue is. So as I said a few minutes ago, in one example we may be client-centered. Another example we might apply a behavioral approach. Another example might be more of a cognitive behavioral approach. So we could do different types of processes or different types of counseling with different consumers. So being knowledgeable of theories is important, and it's important that you as a counselor have a solid foundation to build from. Now obviously this discussion today about different counseling approaches is just touching the surface, if that. That's why we have two classes in this program, one on theories of counseling and theories of personality and counseling, and one on specific counseling approaches that go into these areas certainly in much more depth than we're going to be doing in this class. But to give you an overview, probably the most common counseling approach is the person-centered approach, where having a therapeutic relationship is necessary. It's a humanistic approach, unconditional positive regard, trust, congruence, empathetic understanding, and the role of the counselor basically is to let the consumer talk through an issue and to guide and to clarify and to reflect back to the consumer what the counselor understands. And through that process, the consumer develops this congruence between the way they see themselves and the way they are and the way they'd like to be. And so it's kind of a modified psychoanalytic approach, but it's using more here and now issues, whereas the psychoanalytic approach is more of a regression to an earlier point in the person's life. But person-centered counseling is one of the oldest types of counseling approaches that we would rely upon, and it's one that forms the core of much of what counselors would do, particularly when developing a counseling relationship, when developing or attempting to understand where the consumer is coming from. Another approach, existential counseling, and you can see some of the key theorists. The premise of existential counseling is that human nature is capable of recreating itself as we try to find meaning and purpose in the world. A state of anxiety is normal. The goal is to bring self-awareness to the person, but it's based upon a sense that there's a lot of unknown out in the world, and what we want to do is to find what is the purpose of life. Why are we here, and what is the meaning for us at the micro level. So we look at the macro level, the big picture, so to speak, the big world. Why, what is the meaning of life, and then what is our own personal meaning. And in existential counseling, the therapist deals with the here and now, and obviously the therapeutic relationship is an important component of that process. In Gestalt counseling, human nature is always striving to self-actualize. We are always in the process of becoming. We are always remaking ourselves and discovering ourselves. And the goal is to attain awareness of the self and the environment. And one of the concepts that we recognize in Gestalt approaches is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that would be what areas are we leaving unfinished in our lives. So the empty chair technique basically says, what do you want to say to another person? How do you put your life together? How do you look at all of the components, all of the factors in your life, and put those together? And that's why it's not just different pieces in a person's life, but it's also other aspects that have not been fully explored. And so the goal of awareness and the goal of awareness of the self and the environment has to do with the person understanding all of the pieces in his or her life and then putting those pieces together. The founding area that is led to all of the other counseling approaches comes from psychoanalytic therapy. Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychoanalytic therapy. His view of human nature is that it's deterministic and it's driven by instincts and unconscious motivations. He formulated the id, the ego, and the superego. The id being more of what we would like to do uncontrolled. The ego is our self, and the superego helps to put the brakes on the id. And people go through stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital stages of life, and the goal is to regress to prior times in the person's life to see where the person has developed anxiety or neuroses, and just by that uncovering process, then the theory is that the person becomes whole again, and the person is able to undo the mental damage that was done previously. Ego is a word that has crept into our vocabulary, that we talk about ego in terms of of the self and the presentation that people have, and these three are seen as id, ego, and superego, seen as kind of fighting it out for dominance, and in many respects, it's the interplay of these three that drive and move society forward, and much of psychoanalytic theory has been debunked, but some of the concepts that come out of this, some of the defense mechanisms that Freud has postulated, have remained as part of other theories, or a part of the general vocabulary that we have in life. So psychoanalytic theory has certainly made a very important contribution to counseling approaches, although we really don't use psychoanalytic theory, and it's not widespread, as obviously as client-centered counseling is widespread. Feminist therapy considers the social, cultural, political context that contributes to a person's problems in terms of understanding the person, and it challenges theories that are traditionally taught by white males, Caucasian males from Western cultures. Human nature has to be gender fair and flexible to different cultures, and the goal of feminist therapy is to empower people, to value diversity, to strive for change, and to assist individuals in viewing themselves as agents of change in their own lives. And feminist theory grew out of, as I said, the Caucasian male Western culture therapies, particularly psychoanalytic therapy that I've just previously mentioned. But I do think, obviously, that the things that feminist theory and therapy focus on, social, cultural, and actually environmental, political issues, are certainly very important for us, particularly in terms of understanding human nature and understanding different peoples and understanding of how people function in the world. And in rehabilitation, we certainly talk about empowerment. We want to empower people with disabilities. We want to value diversity. Striving for change is something that I feel strongly about, and not just accepting a status quo, and assisting individuals to be active agents in their own lives is a form of empowerment. Adlerian therapy it flows from psychoanalytic therapy. Adler was one of Freud's contemporaries, and he felt that instead of looking at unconscious processes, that the focus would be on the individual's capacity to consciously strive and create and influence and move forward in a person's life. Adler talked about the importance of birth order, of social learning, and to help clients identify mistaken goals and faulty assumptions that may prevent them from achieving full social connectedness. He also, I believe, talked about inferiority as part of this concept of connectedness, and that's why in many cases it's a theory that has resonance with people in rehabilitation, although he wasn't looking at it from a rehabilitation point of view. In behavior therapy, it's really not based upon personality theory or human nature. It's based more upon conditioning approaches, whether those are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, social learning, cognitive behavior. Classical conditioning, an example of that would be when a bell rings, we know it's time to leave the class. Class is over, and so we mentally are conditioned to do something different. Operant conditioning is based on learning, that the person learns if that person does a behavior, it gets rewarded, and that's a version of social learning as well. And out of that flows the concept of cognitive behavioral, where the counselor or the therapist would challenge the person and challenge the person to eliminate behaviors that interfere with daily living or require new behaviors. It's based upon measurable outcomes. So role-playing is an example of operant conditioning. Systematic desensitization is an example of classical conditioning. So if somebody in systematic desensitization, if someone is fearful of an activity or an event or a place or a person, they would be successively, incrementally placed in that environment, and it becomes, over time, less threatening. That's an example of classical conditioning. The operant conditioning, again, an example of that, a more concrete example, is the role-playing example, where a person is taught different behaviors about how to, let's say, interview for a job or to handle a situation, and that would be an example of operant conditioning. Cognitive behavior therapy assumes that reorganizing one's self-statements will result in a corresponding reorganization of one's behavior. And the proponent of this is Albert Ellis in rational emotive behavior therapy. And his perspective is that people are born with the potential for both rational thinking and irrational thinking. And his approach basically is through this ABC framework in which the person has self-thoughts. Perhaps the person thinks says, no one's going to hire me for a job. And it's the role of the counselor or the therapist in this case to say, well, that's irrational. Why would someone not hire you? I mean, why do you feel this way? And of course, if someone feels that way, that would be something that drives the person's behavior. And the goal of counseling in this context is to have the person rethink the way they are approaching the world, or where they see the world, or no one likes me, or no one's going to be my friend, or people are out to get me. And it's really the goal of the counselor to challenge the person and to say, why, what do you base that on? Why do you say no one is going to be your friend or no one likes you? And to say that's irrational, that's not logical. And that's the goal of the counselor. And a lot of times we use this approach in working with consumers, and I would say that we primarily use the client-centered approach, and we use the rational emotive approach, Albert Ellis, and we use behavioral approaches. I would say those are the three major things that we do. Now, we don't always label the behavioral approach by saying this is conditioning, or this is classical or operant conditioning or social learning. We frame it more in terms of let's role play different situations, or let me help you feel more comfortable talking with employers. That's how we would frame it. And we also use the cognitive behavioral approach when we help somebody to challenge irrational thinking and which may result in behavior that is not reasonable or logical. The final area I'm going to talk about today is reality therapy and choice therapy. William Glasser is the proponent of this. Talks about 5 basic needs of power, love and belonging, freedom, fun, and survival. And here the counselor helps the consumer make a workable plan to achieve various goals. And to change what we do is the key to changing how we feel and what we want to achieve. So this is a very it's kind of a cross between client-centered and a behavioral or rational emotive approach, a little more humanistic. The past as seen as the source of our behaviors, which is Freudian, but the solution is in the present and the future, which is more behavioral and client-centered and rational emotive. So reality therapy kind of mixes different types of approaches, and sometimes we use this without knowing we're using it, but we're using this in mixing behavioral approaches and rational emotive approaches and client-centered approaches in different ways. And so we have this reality therapy, which basically says, acknowledges, yes, that the past is a contributor to the way we are today, but it's not the solution. Understanding the past is not the solution to the present and moving forward. What the solution is to say, what are the goals we want to achieve, and those 5 basic goals, have kind of a cousin in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow approached hierarchy of needs a little differently. He talked about a lower level need would be food and shelter, and then moving up the ladder would be belonging and would be contributing to society and fully functioning, and then self-actualization. So this is not quite a hierarchy as Maslow presents it, but it's more identifying areas that people would require functioning in terms of being able to feel part of the world. And you could say that people who have high levels in these areas, and when he looks at power, let's not confuse power with abuse of power. It's power. It would be more in line of the concept of self-determination and empowerment, rather than taking advantage and using power or having control over others. It's not viewed that way by Glasser. Okay, so I can see that there would be areas in reality therapy that fit in to what we do in working with consumers, and so you have reality therapy really being an amalgamation, as I would see it, of the Freudian approach, behavioral approach, client-centered approach, and it's also our rational emotive approach. And so you can take this, or you can take other approaches that we've been talking about today, and adapt them to the needs of the consumer and the circumstances of the consumer and the particular issue that's being addressed with the consumer. Here are some references on these approaches, and that's the end of this lecture.